it's the females that take them all the time.
And is that why you're particularly fond of them, because the females are in charge?
Well, that's the way the glen runs. The females are in charge.
The females are in charge, yeah. And Anna, you don't have the wee biting beasties as well.
We don't have the biting beasties. Believe us, when we're here and having to do our work in July and August, you get in and out as quickly as you can.
Midges?
Midges.
They become sort of desensitised to humans. But that's just with general people walking through and talking.
I know a few humans become desensitised to humans as well, but there you go.
As a child, I would have come down here because I just loved it. I just think it's a very magical place and very, very special place, and also it's very ancient.
Far across yonder blue lies a true fairy land, where the sea ripples over the shingle and sand, where the gay honeysuckle is luring the bee, and the green glens of Antrim are calling to me. Kenneth North is the aptly named songwriter who provided us with this archetypal emigrant's lament, as he yearns for the lush green glens that nurtured his soul in the days of his youth. Quite often such songs are written with a rosy hindsight that tends to embellish the scene somewhat. But I have to say, having spent a number of days in this one of the lesser known and perhaps less celebrated of the 9 glens, is that my entirely detached and objective impression is that it is indeed a true fairy land. Welcome to Glenshesk on the Antrim coast in the northeast corner of Ulster. It's the month of January in Glenshesk, so the honeysuckle and the bee are not much in evidence, and the weather is a fickle thing. But the midwinter light casts its own enchantment, accentuating the fine bone structure of the glen and the lean contours that will later be softened by summer's excesses. Because the 9 glens of Antrim share a common geological ancestry, we tend to think of them as one entity. But the danger in using a collective term like the glens of Antrim is that we see only the family resemblances and fail to recognise the fact that each has its own distinctive character, its own individual history. Unlike its sisters, which all travel towards the Sea of Moyle in a general easterly direction, Glenshesk strikes out northward, as if intent on reaching Rathlin Island, a giant stepping stone on the way to the Mull of Kintyre and the Inner Hebrides of Scotland beyond. Just before it reaches the coast, the Glenshesk River joins up with the Carry and the Tow to form the Margie River, which flows into the sea at Ballycastle. And it's the Margie River that Rory McQuillan used to name the Franciscan friary that he established here round about the year 1500. If being a roofless ancient monument can be called a form of survival, then Bonamargie Friary has survived centuries of turbulent conflict, destruction, refurbishment and further destruction. Its ownership, more often than not, decided at the point of a sword, wielded more often than not by the hands of the warring clans of the McQuillans, the O'Cahans and the ultimate victors in the struggle for lordship of the glens, the MacDonalds. Colin Breen is a maritime archaeologist based at the University of Ulster who hails from Cork originally. But he paints such a detailed picture of the life and times of Bonamargie Friary that you'd almost believe he was born in it. Colin, as I've said, specialises in maritime archaeology. So would he describe Bonamargie as a maritime site?
I suppose in many senses it is a maritime monument, not only just in terms of its geographical setting. You know, we're only about 200-300 metres from the sea here. We're sitting on top of a series of coastal dunes, but much more than that, it was a maritime monument probably in a metaphorical sense. We don't know a huge amount about the McQuillans, but we know that by the middle part of the 15th century they had essentially established themselves as the major dominant family grouping in this area. And like many of these Gaelic groupings, one of the big ways that they demonstrated their power, their prestige, their wealth, their status within the landscape was through the patronage of these types of places. Yeah. It's positioned within this fantastic valley surrounded by the uplands, looking out over the sea. And much more than that, it's looking out over towards Rathlin. It's looking out beyond towards Islay. And remember, Islay and the Scottish Islands, they represent the heartland, the homelands of many of these groupings that are subsequent significantly involved in this site.
That's the thing you have to take into account, because their notion of geography is slightly different from our modern notion, because, okay, here they were at the edge of the North Antrim coast, but they felt themselves belonging more out to this maritime area out here, really, across to Scotland and so on.
I think that's exactly it. And it was very much this sense of interconnectedness, an interconnectedness that was drawn together by marine communication, by sea traffic, by sea travel.
But you could argue that it was that very interconnectedness with the Scottish coast that proved to be the ultimate undoing of the McQuillans. Throughout the early 1500s, they dominated the area east of the River Bann from their precipitous power base at Dunluce Castle further along the coast. But they were at constant and violent loggerheads with their neighbours the O'Cahans, who ruled the territory immediately west of the Bann. In 1544, the McQuillans invoked the Scottish connection. They invited the MacDonalds over from Islay to help them in their fight against the O'Cahans, and that, according to Colin, was a major strategic mistake.
They very quickly usurped the McQuillans. They take Dunluce Castle from them, and they also take this site. They take Bunamargy from them as well. And in later years, they actually build their family vault, and most of their early leaders, their big men, are buried here at this site. Prior to this, of course, most of these Scottish Gaelic lordships, they would have invariably been buried in Iona. But now we're seeing this kind of reversion back to this Irish mainland, this connection, this re-established, this reimagining themselves essentially as an Irish Gaelic lordship, and they now bury themselves within the Ulster landscape.
So that's got great symbolic value as well, in other words.
Oh, very much so. You know, the fact that they were no longer buried or commemorated in Iona, they're now buried here in Ulster is really important and hugely significant.
Bunamargy Friary then, founded originally by the McQuillans, was to become the final resting place of their arch foes, the MacDonalds, who added their own ancillary chapel and vault in later years. But the whole site has to be seen as the result of fairly continuous evolution over the centuries, destroyed, abandoned, repaired and restored to altered use on a number of occasions. At one stage, an English garrison stabled their horses here. The Western Range, as it's called, was an afterthought, providing a cloistered area for prayerful Franciscan friars, one of whose guiding precepts was, "You will take nothing hence other than your deeds, nor can you prolong your life, nor evade death." That would have been a sobering thought for those warring chieftains, who nonetheless sought a kind of posthumous comfort by being buried in the earliest part of the building, the nave.
During the medieval period, it would have been the most prestigious place in the church would have been to be buried just in front or by the altar. Yeah. So the original altar, the priest would have stood just here in front of the eastern window. You know, of course, originally in the earlier church, the priest would have actually faced the east. They would have faced away from the congregation.
With their back to the congregation.
With their back to the congregation. Yeah. So the lords, the big people in society, it would have been the most prestigious thing to be buried in and around this area.
Great.
That went out of fashion later on. But this is probably the most interesting part of the site. It's probably got one of the most fascinating parts of the story, but this is the MacDonald Vault.
Right.
So if we opened this and we went down into it, now we would see a series of coffins.
Really?
When it was first looked at, probably scientifically in the 19th century, one of the big antiquarians went into the site and he recorded 6 coffins, two wooden coffins and a lead casket, a lead type coffin. And he could read the inscriptions at the time, and most of the later coffins, they were of the later Earls of Antrim, late 17th century, early part of the 18th century, and their wives. The wooden coffin, one of the decayed wooden coffins, probably held the body of Randall MacDonald, the first Earl of Antrim, died 1628. And then the lead casket, or the lead coffin as Bigger referred to it, probably held the body of Sorley Boy MacDonald, probably the most famous MacDonald, buried within this place.
Are they still in there?
They're still here. They're still here. Remember, this is the living place. This is the burial place, the primary burial place of the MacDonalds of Antrim.
I suppose in strictly historical terms, the most important person buried here at Bonamargee Friary would be the famous chieftain Sorley Boy MacDonald. But talk to anybody who grew up hereabouts and they will tell you that as children, the person they chiefly associated with this place was a woman, Julia McQuillan, otherwise known as the Black Nun, whose ghost is said to haunt these ancient ruins. She certainly haunted their imaginations and ensured that nobody came here alone, especially after dark. This curious little headstone or cross centre with the hole in the middle marks the spot where she asked to be buried, near the church entrance, so that people could walk on her grave as a sign of her humility. But you weren't encouraged to stand on the 7th step of the stone staircase inside the friary, because you would be cursed and have visions of blood dripping, because that is where she met her death, murdered, we're told, by persons unknown. Julia McQuillan lived here as a recluse sometime in the 1600s, and she's reputed to have made a number of prophecies which have since come to pass. For instance, she predicted that a red-haired priest would be appointed here and be drowned in the sea the very next day. And precisely that is said to have happened in the early 1900s. And that a horseless carriage would fly over the forest. Some people swear she was referring to the arrival of the railway, which indeed took the route that she predicted. Also, that 2 standing stones in the area would come together, which they did after a fashion when they were building Ballycastle harbour in the 1700s. The thing that strikes me about those predictions, or prophecies if you like, is that none of them appear to have come true in her own lifetime, nor in the lifetime of anyone who was around to hear her make such predictions. Which leads me to believe that it's easy to make predictions, as long as you don't put any kind of time scale on it. Well, I'm going to stick my neck out now and make a prediction within a time scale. I predict that before this hour is over, as we travel further up the glen, we're going to encounter something else that came over from the Scottish Isles and made Glenshesk their home. The McCahon-Sowie Alliance, when we come back. The scholars will tell you that Glenshesk means the barren glen. That doesn't sit too well with the people who farm its slopes. They prefer the Glen of the Sedges, pointing out its summer lushness and its winter promise of better days to come. Brian McCahan's sheep may need a helping hand at this barren time of year, but this flock have been wintering in Glenshesk for hundreds of years, nearly as long as the McCahans themselves. Not so these tawny little wildlings, brought here a few generations ago from the island of Sowie and the archipelago of St Kilda off the coast of Scotland. Brian and his wife Una and I are bringing them some feed to discover which is their stronger instinct, distrust of humans or hunger.
I'm not sure what to do. And is there a hierarchy amongst them?
Very much so. Among the rams, there will be dominant rams. But actually, the leaders of the flock are female.
Really?
Which is very strange.
How does that work?
It will be the females will lead them to the sheltered ground in times of snow and storm.
Right.
And as they graze and go for fresh grazing, Joe, it's the females that take them all the time.
And is that why you're particularly fond of them, because the females are in charge? Is
Well, that's the way the glen runs. The females are in charge,
the
definitely,
females are in
Joe.
charge. Yeah. So, I mean, how many would be there altogether? There must be 100 of this.
Well, we would have about 150 on the farm.
All right.
But there would be about 100 in this particular group.
Right. Are they normally wary of people? You said they're kind of feral now at this stage, aren't they?
Well,